A tanker transiting off the United Arab Emirates was struck early this morning by unidentified projectiles, setting off a fresh round of alarm over one of the world's most important shipping lanes. The United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations issued an advisory saying the vessel was hit while about 78 nautical miles north of Fujairah. All crew members were reported safe. The attack, which for now remains unattributed, is the latest flare in a busy week of maritime incidents that have pushed tensions in and around the Strait of Hormuz to new heights. At the heart of the response is a United States military operation now being rolled out under the name Project Freedom. U.S. Central Command announced on May 3 that CENTCOM forces would begin supporting Project Freedom on May 4 with what it described as the immediate objective of restoring freedom of navigation for commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. CENTCOM's public statement framed the move as a mission directed from the White House to ensure merchant ships can transit this narrow but crucial corridor without harassment. CENTCOM said the mission directed by the president will support merchant vessels seeking to freely transit through the essential international trade corridor, as President Donald Trump signaled the same intent directly over the weekend. In a Truth Social post and follow-up remarks, he described a new immediate effort to free ships that he said have been effectively trapped in the Strait. President Donald Trump said, "As for the good of Iran, the Middle East, and the United States, we've told these countries that we will guide their ships safely out of these restricted waterways so that they can freely and obligely get on with their business," had a humanitarian gesture intended to help neutral countries whose vessels are caught in the disruption. That announcement and the military support that followed set an already fragile ceasefire and as a brittle dip. Diplomatic lull on edge. CENTCOM's press release spelled out the scale of the American contribution: guided missile destroyers, more than 100 land and sea-based aircraft, multi-domain unmanned systems, and roughly 15,000 service members slated to support the effort. Admiral Brad Cooper, who leads CENTCOM, put the operation in blunt economic and security terms. Admiral Brad Cooper said, "Our support for this defensive mission is essential to regional security and the global economy, as we also maintain the naval blockade." Cooper and other officials warned that the Strait carries roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil and large volumes of fuel and fertilizer, cargoes that make any interruption immediately consequential for markets and for food and energy security worldwide. The military move follows a staccato of incidents just days earlier. The UK MTO posted a separate report that the master of a northbound bulk carrier had told authorities the vessel was attacked by multiple small craft, some 11 nautical miles west of Zurich on Iran's southern coast. Again, all crew were confirmed safe, and there were no immediate reports of pollution. Maritime monitors and ship operators have responded to that clustering of encounters by warning commercial masters to exercise extreme caution and to keep UK MTO and coalition bodies apprised of suspicious activity. On the diplomatic front, the reaction has been immediate and mixed. Tehran framed any unilateral outside military action in the Strait as a violation of the ceasefire and as a provocation. Iranian officials have repeatedly insisted that foreign warships operating in the narrow waters near their coastline amount to a breach of the understandings that paused kinetic operations earlier this spring. Iran's parliamentary leadership has also telegraphed a legislative response draft rules that, if enacted, would formalize tighter controls over who may transit the Strait and on what terms. Among the proposals discussed in Iranian parliamentary debate is a permanent ban on Israeli-flagged ships and new requirements that vessels from countries judged hostile secure prior permission before passage. Some Iranian lawmakers have even spoken in terms of demanding reparations from governments deemed adversarial before allowing their vessels to pass. Those proposed controls immediately put private shipping owners, insurers, and states with merchant fleets in an impossible compliance bind. Washington's Treasury has already moved to warn industry that payments to Iranian authorities, whether described as tolls, fees, toll-like arrangements, or even informal transfers, could carry sanctions risk. The U.S. informal transfers could carry sanctions risk. Office of Foreign Assets Control's caution firms that U.S. persons are broadly prohibited from making payments to designated Iranian entities, and that non-U.S. companies can also face secondary consequences if their transactions cause banks, insurers, or other U.S. regulated entities to run afoul of U.S. export sanctions. That guidance listed a variety of payment forms, traditional currency, cash, digital assets, and informal swaps, underscoring how wide the net of risk has grown. At sea, the picture is hardly binary. Monitoring groups tracking ship movements say Iran has been creative in trying to move oil around the blockade that U.S. forces announced in mid-April. A maritime tracking firm reported this week that a very large crude carrier belonging to Iran's national tanker company, identified as Huge, has been observed in the Asia-Pacific after long periods of radio silence and AAI signal darkening. The tracker reported the vessel was carrying roughly 1.9 million barrels of crude and was last sighted near Sri Lanka before moving through Indonesian waters. Those accounts have prompted renewed questions about the effectiveness of the USS naval blockade and about the tactics used by state and shadow fleets to avoid detection, switching off identification transponders, operating through co-emplex intermediary owners, and routing via long, circuitous voyages. That cat-and-mouse dynamic on the water complicates any neat narrative of control. U.S. military officials assert the blockade has forced many Iranian-linked vessels to turn back and cost Tehran billions in lost revenue. Iranian state media counters that dozens of ships have nonetheless found ways to breach restrictions. The gulf between those claims matters because it shapes perceptions in global markets and in capitals that must decide whether to accept residual disruption, to pay steep insurance costs, or to change supply lines altogether. Beyond energy, the disruption is already being felt in humanitarian operations. The UN Refugee Agency has warned that rerouting supply lines to bypass the Gulf and route aid around Africa is doubling delivery times and sharply raising costs for critical missions to places such as Sudan. For aid organizations, margins, extra week's eye, and transit can mean the difference between life and death for vulnerable populations. This sudden maritime flashpoint is cascading into geopolitics at the highest level. China, which depends on imported oil in quantities far larger than most other powers, has made plain that the Strait's status will weigh on the planned summit between President Trump and President Xi Jinping in Beijing later this month. China's ambassador to the United Nations, Fu Kong, who holds the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council this month, warned that if the Strait of Hormuz remains in crisis when the U.S. president lands in Beijing, the issue will be central to the talks. Beijing is anxious. Almost half of its crude imports move through the Gulf, and anything that threatens that flow is an immediate strategic concern for Beijing's leaders and for the Chinese economy. Across Europe and among other trading partners, reactions have been cautious. Some governments have voiced formal willingness to consider defensive escort operations, but major navies have been reluctant to be drawn into what many governments view as a U.S.-led escalation that risks a dangerous new chapter in a broader regional conflict. France and others have described possible missions as defensive in nature and have conditioned any direct participation on mandated legal and political guardrails. The diplomatic calculus is clear. Nations that rely on the global economy for growth are wary both of a prolonged closure and of being sucked into another kinetic ground. For merchant shipping, the choices are limited. Owners can accept higher premiums for Gulf transits, reroute around the Cape of Good Hope with long detours that add time and cost, or anchor and wait actions that ripple into refinery schedules, commodity contracts, and downstream manufacturing. Freight indices have already reflected the disruption, and traders watching the market are braced for volatility should the Strait see more seizures, freedom of navigation, or further military interdictions. Back in Tehran, the rhetoric has hardened even as negotiators and mediators work to keep diplomatic channels open. Iran has accused the United States of piracy for intercepting ships under the blockade the U.S. announced in mid-April, a charge Washington rejects, and Tehran's officials insist they are protecting their sovereign waters from foreign coercion. Sort of the political theater inside Iran is intense. Some hardline voices push for permanent legal restrictions on passage. Others urge caution to avoid widening the war's footprint. That domestic debate matters because it will shape the practical consequences for commercial mariners. A new law that requires prior permission to transit or that institutes long-term tolls would not only complicate shipping operations, but could force flag states, insurers, and ports to make swift, painful decisions about routing, registration, and liability. Regulators and industry bodies are already scrambling to advise vessel masters how to navigate a labyrinth of legal and operational risk. At the core of the unfolding drama are ordinary crews on ordinary ships who find themselves at the crossroads of geopolitics. The crew members on the tanker near Fujairah and on the bulk carrier off Sirte were reported safe. But the incidents are a reminder that the human cost, the fear, stress, and potential for catastrophe is real and immediate. For seafarers who operate under tight schedules and strained fatigue margins, the disruption is dangerous both at sea and ashore. For the international community, the immediate test will be whether Project Freedom de-escalates or exacerbates the situation. The United States and its partners say the goal is narrow and defensive, to restore the basic principle that the high seas remain open to commerce. Iran calls the same actions provocative and potentially illegal. The narrow lane of diplomacy that has kept a tentative ceasefire in place since early April is now under strain strain from a sequence of incidents that could easily be misunderstood or misread on the water. In the hours and days ahead, watch for 3 immediate markers: whether Project Freedom's military presence succeeds in escorting ships without incident, whether maritime insurance and shipping lines resume transit through the Strait of Hormuz, and whether mediators can cement a durable extension to the current pause in hostilities. The answers will determine whether the world sees a short, risky reprieve or the start of a more sustained collision between naval power and maritime commerce. This morning's strikes on commercial vessels, the escalation of naval deployments, and the raft of new legislative and sanctions warnings have combined to make the Strait of Hormuz more than a local flashpoint. It is now a global economic and diplomatic pressure point for the men and women at sea, for the countries that depend on the cargoes that pass there, and for the policymakers who must weigh the line between protection and provocation. The coming days will be decisive. We will continue to monitor official briefings, maritime advisories, and diplomatic channels as Project Freedom unfolds and as international partners and adversaries respond. The immediate facts are stark. A tanker struck 78 nautical miles north of Fujairah. A bulk carrier reported an attack 11 nautical miles west of Sirak. CENTCOM and President Trump have launched an operation to free stranded ships, and the diplomatic fault lines between Tehran and Washington and between their international interlocutors remain perilously thin.